ringing of the doorbell came every night without fail. It was never at any regular time, just whenever the darkness of the evening settled over the quiet suburban neighborhood. At first, the family thought it was just the wind playing tricks on them, or perhaps a prank from one of the neighborhood kids. But as the days passed, the ringing didn't stop. Each night as the family tried to settle in for the evening, the unmistakable sound of the doorbell echoed through their home. The chime was clear and sharp, reverberating through the walls. But when they opened the door, there was never anyone there. Michael and Claire Hastings lived in a comfortable house at the end of the cul-de-sac. Their children, Emily and Ben, were young, just old enough to enjoy the safety of their home and the neighborhood. It was the kind of place where the days stretched lazily into warm evenings, where the sound of children playing could be heard in the distance, and where the only real concern was the occasional passing of a stray dog or the neighbor's cat darting across the yard. Their home had always felt safe, but now that safety was beginning to slip away, piece by piece, like sand slipping through their fingers. The first night it happened, Michael had opened the door to find no one standing on the porch. The second night, he had been a little more cautious, but again, no one was there. By the third night, he was becoming annoyed. He checked the entire front yard and driveway, peering around corners and beneath the bushes, but there was no one. The doorbell kept ringing, and each time they answered, the porch was empty. At first, it seemed like nothing more than an annoyance, a glitch maybe in the world around them. But as the days passed, Michael began to feel an unsettling sensation, an unease creeping into his chest every time the doorbell rang. Claire noticed it too. She could feel her pulse quicken each night as the house grew quieter, only to be broken by the sharp chime of the doorbell. They tried to ignore it at first, thinking it was some sort of mischief or technical glitch, but the constant ringing gnawed at their nerves. Every night, without fail, it rang, so loud, so clear, it could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Emily and Ben, who were normally carefree and filled with energy, became quiet at night, often hiding under their covers when the bell rang, their faces pale and full of worry. The neighbors, when asked, all seemed to be in agreement that they hadn't heard anything strange, but they also didn't seem to be paying attention. They were too wrapped up in their own lives, their own schedules, to notice the oddity. As Michael and Claire sat in their living room, the sound of the doorbell echoing in their ears, they grew more and more desperate for an explanation. They had no idea what was happening, but they knew something wasn't right. It was as if something or someone was trying to get their attention. But every time they opened the door, there was nothing but the empty darkness outside. The stress began to wear on them. Claire stopped sleeping well, her nights filled with restless tossing and turning. Michael found himself getting up more frequently, his nerves stretched tight as the doorbell rang again, always at the same time each night. The kids had started asking questions. "Why does the doorbell keep ringing, Mom?" Emily would ask, her voice small and uncertain. "Who's at the door?" Ben would add, his wide eyes reflecting the same unease that had been growing in their parents' hearts. It wasn't long before Michael made a decision. He had to figure out what was happening. He couldn't keep living like this, feeling as though they were being watched or toyed with, hearing that incessant ringing echoing in the quiet of the night. They needed answers. So Michael did what anyone would do in the age of technology. He installed a camera. He carefully set up the security camera by the front door. It was a simple motion sensor camera with infrared capabilities, capable of capturing clear video, even in the darkest of nights. If anyone was playing tricks on them, he would catch them. And if nothing appeared on the footage, well, that would at least confirm they weren't imagining things. They weren't crazy. It had to be something. There had to be a logical explanation. The first night with the camera was unsettling. The doorbell rang at its usual time. Michael and Claire watched as the video feed displayed the empty porch, just as it always had. Nothing. No strange figure lurking in the shadows. No silhouette of a prankster lurking by the door. It was just empty. The camera didn't pick up any motion. No strange shapes. No anomalies. It was as though the doorbell had rung on its own. The footage was clean, clear. No one had come near the door, but the next night the doorbell rang again. And again, the camera caught nothing. No one approached. No one was in the frame. Nothing at all. It became almost maddening. How could the doorbell keep ringing night after night when there was no one there? It wasn't a mechanical issue. The doorbell wasn't broken. And the camera certainly worked. Each night it recorded nothing, but it did its job. Still, the feeling of unease crept deeper into their hearts. They had caught no one on the footage, but the doorbell still rang. Every night, at the same time. Claire began to feel like they were trapped in some kind of loop, a nightmare that didn't end. She would walk to the door each time the bell rang, always with that same sinking feeling in her stomach. She could feel her heart racing, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up as she reached for the handle. But when the door opened, it was always just the emptiness, the dark porch stretching out in front of her. No one there. No sound except the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. She began to dread the ringing. It felt unnatural. She couldn't explain why, but it seemed wrong. Everything about it felt wrong. One evening, Michael stayed up late, watching the footage again. He had a bad feeling, an irrational dread that he couldn't shake. He watched as the doorbell rang, and he zoomed in on the footage, hoping for something. A flicker, a shadow, anything. The time was exactly 10:32 p.m. The bell rang, and there, in the footage, he saw it. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, a glitch, but then he saw it again. On the screen, there was a figure, but it wasn't like any figure he had seen before. It wasn't a person. It was him, Michael, standing at the door, his own face staring back at him. There he was, in full view, his outline clear in the dim light from the porch. But the figure wasn't moving. He wasn't even there. It was impossible. Michael froze, his heart pounding. He looked at Claire, who had come into the room and was staring at the screen with a pale face. "What the hell is this?" she whispered. The figure on the screen didn't blink. It didn't move. It was him, but it wasn't him. The longer they stared at the footage, the more the reality of it settled in. They weren't just seeing things. There was no mistaking it. It was him, the exact same figure. But the real Michael was standing right next to Claire, horrified, watching the screen. There was no logical explanation for it. There couldn't be. Then, suddenly, the figure at the door began to move. Slowly, stiffly, like it was just waking up from a long sleep. The doorbell rang again. The figure raised its hand, as though it was about to reach for the doorbell itself, about to ring it once more. But it didn't. The figure turned and started to walk away. It moved with the kind of deliberate slowness that sent a cold shiver down their spines. Michael and Claire exchanged a horrified glance. The footage on the camera flickered, and the figure in the doorway disappeared. The video feed went dark, and the doorbell rang again. Michael sat in front of the screen, the glow of the camera feed casting a faint light across his tired face. The footage was grainy but clear enough, too clear. What he had seen was impossible, or so he had hoped. But it was there, staring back at him. His own reflection. Or at least, that was what it seemed like. He rubbed his eyes as if doing so might erase the image burned into his mind. But it didn't. It was still there, in front of him. Claire, standing beside him, was equally silent. She had seen it too. The impossible, the unexplainable. For a moment, neither of them moved. They simply stared at the dark screen, which seemed to pulse in rhythm with their hearts. That's not possible, Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. Michael swallowed, feeling the weight of her words hang in the air. He could barely comprehend what he had seen. The figure at the door, the one that looked like him, hadn't been right. Its movements were too slow, too deliberate. And then it just walked away, disappeared into the night. No sound, no sign of its presence on the porch. It was as though it had never been there at all. Let's just try to sleep, Michael said, his voice shaky. We'll figure this out in the morning. It's just a glitch. But neither of them felt reassured. Neither of them believed it was a glitch. Not anymore. Something else was at play here. Something much darker. They tried to sleep, but neither of them could. Every time the doorbell rang, both of them would freeze. Michael would glance at the clock, 10:32 p.m. each time without fail. The time seemed to mock him now. The sound of the bell, sharp and cold, echoed through the walls of the house. It was like a constant drumbeat, a reminder that they were not alone, even though the porch remained empty. Still, the camera showed nothing. Nothing but the emptiness of the night. The following nights passed the same way. The bell rang, and the footage caught nothing. Every time, Michael and Claire opened the door, half expecting to see the same figure. But nothing. Just the cold darkness of their front porch. The quiet suburban streets stretching endlessly into the distance. They tried everything to make sense of it. They checked the wiring, the settings on the camera, and even the doorbell itself. They called in an electrician who assured them the system was working fine. But still, the ringing continued. Still, the camera showed nothing. No person, no figure, just empty air. At times, Michael would stand by the door, his hand on the knob, feeling as though he was waiting for something. Something terrible. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, even when no one was there. And Claire, she had stopped sleeping altogether. Her eyes were hollow, her face pale. The exhaustion was taking its toll, but neither of them could escape the gnawing fear that had gripped their home. One night, Claire couldn't take it anymore. She insisted that they do something, anything, to end the madness. We can't keep living like this, she said, her voice strained. We need to know what's going on. So they did something drastic. They decided to stay up that night and watch the feed together. They would not open the door this time. They would stay behind the safety of the camera. They would wait, and they would watch. It was 10:32 p.m. when it happened again. The doorbell rang. Both Michael and Claire tensed, their hearts in their throats. The camera feed flickered to life, the image of their front porch appearing on the screen. They both stared at it, eyes wide, waiting for something, anything, to happen. For a long time, nothing did. The porch was empty, the darkness deep and suffocating. Then, slowly, Michael noticed something. A shadow, barely perceptible at first. It seemed to linger just outside the frame of the camera. He leaned closer, his breath catching in his chest. The shadow shifted, moving just at the edge of their vision. But it wasn't a person. No, it wasn't right. It was as though something was crawling just out of sight. Something that didn't belong. Something that shouldn't exist. Claire gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she saw it too. The shadow was growing, shifting in ways that didn't make sense. The porch light flickered, casting strange shapes against the wall. But still, there was nothing visible in the doorway. The shadow moved again, closer this time, stretching unnaturally across the porch. Michael's breath caught in his throat. He had no idea what was happening, but he knew it was not normal. The doorbell rang again, and this time, the shadow was unmistakable. It was like a figure, no, a presence, moving in and out of the camera's field of vision. It was as though something was trying to step into the light, but couldn't. It was as though it was being pulled back, unwilling to fully show itself. Michael felt his skin crawl, and he could feel Claire's tense beside him. Then, abruptly, the shadow stopped. The porch was empty again, as though nothing had happened. The doorbell stopped ringing. The camera feed showed nothing but the empty porch, the street lamp casting a dim light over the steps. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in the yard. Claire's voice trembled as she spoke. That wasn't normal. What was that? I don't know, Michael replied, his voice low. He was afraid to speak, afraid to break the silence. I don't know, Claire, but something's wrong. They sat in silence for a while, both staring at the empty porch. Every second felt like an eternity. The doorbell had stopped ringing, but the tension in the room was unbearable. Every creak of the house, every shift in the darkness, felt like something was watching them, but they didn't know what. The next few nights were eerily quiet. No more shadows, no more strange movements. The doorbell rang, of course, but the camera picked up nothing. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the strange events had stopped. Michael and Claire had almost convinced themselves that it had all been a strange, shared hallucination. Maybe the stress had finally caught up with them. Maybe they were imagining things. Maybe. But then, one night, it happened again. The doorbell rang at 10:32 p.m. The familiar chime filled the air, breaking the silence of the house. Claire's eyes went wide, and Michael's heart skipped a beat. This time, they didn't hesitate. They didn't wait. They both stood up, rushing to the camera. But when they checked the feed, their stomachs dropped. The figure was back. This time, there was no shadow, no vague outline. It was standing in full view, right at the door. It was Michael, or at least it looked like him. The figure was exactly the same, down to the smallest detail. But something was wrong. It wasn't the way he moved. It wasn't the way it looked. It was something deeper, something that made the hair on the back of their necks stand up. The figure didn't move, not yet. But it was there, standing at the door, watching them. Michael's breath came in ragged gasps, and Claire's eyes were wide with fear. Michael, Claire whispered, barely able to speak. What is that? What's happening? The figure on the screen reached out, its hand moving slowly toward the door. But before it could touch the handle, the screen flickered. The doorbell rang again. The feed went black, and then the doorbell rang once more. The silence after the final ring was deafening. The feed had gone dark. the room filled only with the soft hum of the camera's standby light. Michael and Claire stood frozen in place, their hearts pounding in their chests. The doorbell had stopped ringing, but neither of them could move. Their minds raced, but nothing made sense. The darkness outside the door seemed to stretch out impossibly long, like an abyss waiting to swallow them whole. The figure, the doppelganger, had vanished from the screen, leaving only emptiness in its wake. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the feeling that someone was still there. Michael forced himself to take a step back from the screen, his legs trembling beneath him. Claire clutched his arm, her fingers cold and tight. They had been through so much already, but now the true horror of what was happening began to sink in. This wasn't just a prank. This wasn't some freak accident or glitch in the system. This was real. They were being stalked by something that looked like them, by something that knew them, and something that wasn't human. "Claire," Michael whispered hoarsely, his voice cracking. "I don't know what to do." Her eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of fear and disbelief. She was silent for a long time, staring at the black screen of the camera. It seemed to mock them, its emptiness all-consuming. Then, with a shaky breath, she spoke. "We need to go. We need to leave this house." Michael's stomach churned. He knew she was right. Every fiber of his being screamed that they weren't safe anymore, that they hadn't been safe for a long time. But as he looked around the room, at the walls that had once felt like a sanctuary, he realized that it was too late to leave. Whatever was happening wasn't something they could escape by simply walking away. "We can't run," Michael muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "We need to end this. We need to find out what this is." Claire's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, resigned. "But how? How do we stop it?" They turned back to the camera, the screen flickering briefly before stabilizing again. The house around them seemed to hum with a low, ominous energy, as if the very walls were alive with a malevolent force. Michael had always been a man of logic, of reason, but there was no explaining this, no rationalizing it. The events they had witnessed, the figures, the shadows, the inexplicable ringing, defied everything they knew. "We need to confront it," Michael said, his voice steady despite the chaos inside his mind. "Whatever it is, it wants us to open the door. Let's see what happens when we don't." They moved cautiously toward the door, the air thick with tension. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet as they approached the entryway, the low hum of the camera still filling the room. Claire clutched the edge of the doorframe, her breath shallow. Michael stood beside her, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He glanced at the camera one last time. There was no movement. The porch was empty. With a trembling hand, he turned the knob. The door creaked open slowly, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. The street was quiet, still. No sound, no motion. It was as though the world had held its breath, waiting. But then, out of the corner of his eye, Michael saw it. A shadow flickering at the edge of the camera's vision. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And then it grew, stretching out in front of them, coalescing into something familiar. The figure appeared again, this time standing in front of them, just outside the threshold. It was Michael, or it looked like him. The same features, the same posture, the same face. But it was wrong. It was empty, hollow. Its eyes were dark, devoid of any life. Its skin seemed to shimmer, like something not quite real. as though it was trying to hold its shape but couldn't. Michael froze, his breath catching in his throat. This wasn't just a reflection or some trick of the light. This thing, this figure, was standing before him. It looked at him with its hollow eyes, and for a moment Michael thought he saw a flicker of recognition in its gaze. He reached out, his fingers brushing the door frame, as though testing the reality of it. But the moment his fingers touched the wood, the figure began to twitch, its form warping and distorting like a heat wave rising off pavement. It was as though the thing was trying to hold itself together, but it couldn't. The figure's movements became jerky, unnatural, like a puppet whose strings had been yanked too hard. It twisted, its mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Claire stepped back, a horrified gasp escaping her lips. "Michael, don't." But it was too late. The figure lunged forward. The door slammed shut with a force that rattled the entire house. Michael and Claire stumbled backward, their hearts hammering in their chests. The house seemed to tremble around them, as though the very foundation was shaking. And then the doorbell rang again, but this time it wasn't the same. It wasn't the usual clear chime. It was distorted, broken, like a scream trapped inside the bell. It reverberated through the house, louder and louder, until it felt as though the sound was coming from inside their heads. The camera feed flickered once more, and when the image stabilized, they saw the figure again. This time, it wasn't just standing at the door. It was inside, its shadow stretching across the walls, its presence consuming the space. It was there, in the living room with them. And then, slowly, the figure began to speak, not with words, but with something far worse. It was like a voice, but not a human one. It was cold, hollow, like 1,000 whispers layered on top of each other, all speaking at once. The words were unintelligible, but the tone, oh, the tone, was something Michael and Claire would never forget. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like the air itself was alive with them. Claire screamed, backing away, but Michael couldn't move. He couldn't look away from the figure. It was them. It was him. It was a twisted version of him, but it wasn't him at all. And then, the figure stepped forward. Suddenly, the door behind them burst open. The real doorbell rang again, louder than ever, but it wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was coming from everywhere. The walls, the floors, the air itself, everywhere. The ringing reached a deafening crescendo, and for one terrible moment, Michael realized the truth. The ringing, the figure, the haunting presence. It was never about the door. It had always been about them, about the connection they shared. The house had been a trap, a place where they were bound to face something far worse than they could have ever imagined. They weren't just being haunted, they were being erased. The figure reached out, its fingers curling into a claw, and everything went black. The last thing Michael saw was his own face, twisted and distorted, staring back at him. Just before everything faded into nothing, the doorbell rang once more, and this time, there was no answer.